Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you've had a good lunch and time to reflect on this morning's proceedings. So we're going to start now again with a session on the emergency task force. So how that works to address public health emergencies, and obviously building on a lot of experience from the last 2 years. So I'm delighted to welcome Marco Cavalieri, who's head of biological health threats and vaccine strategy at the EMA, and Bruno Spodes, who's CHMP vice chair, and Marco and Bruno are co-chairs of the new ETF now as it launches. So I'll hand over to you both for session two. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fergus. And it is my pleasure to welcome everybody to this session and to co-chair with Bruno, with whom I've been working in the past year as part of the COVID-19 task force, and we will be working even more in the future. So I don't know, Bruno, any initial remarks from your side?
Just a thank you, Marco. The pleasure is mine to start this new adventure by your side again, and also to extend a warm welcome to all the participants, not only in the panel, but of course in the World Wide Web that are attending.
Thank you, Bruno. And just to say that indeed during this session, we will focus on the composition, tasks, and responsibilities of the emergency task force during a public health emergency, and we will also address preparedness activities for future emergencies. So in this respect, I would like to introduce my colleague Manuela Mura, who is from the EMA Biological Health Threats and Vaccine Strategy Office as a specialist, who will take us through the content of the regulation and the immediate actions that are needed to transition from the current situation, as well as the timelines and actions that are needed to implement additional tasks and activities under the EMA's extending mandates. So over to you, Manuela.
Thank you very much, Marco and Bruno. If I can have the slides. Thank you very much. So my name is Manuela Mura, and I will not spend any more time on this introduction as was already provided by Marco. So if we can move forward to the next slide. This is just to summarize what I will tell you today. I will speak about the role of the EMA in public health emergencies. I will tell you a little bit about the new emergency task force. What is this group, its composition, tasks, and responsibilities? I will also tell you a little bit about the next step for this group. And finally, I will give you an overview of the EMA tasks, which are also stemming from the new regulation to support the work of the ETF. And finally, I will leave you with a few take-home messages. So if we move to the next slide concerning the EMA role in public health emergencies, the role of the agency is framed by the decision on cross-border health threat of the European Union. And within this legal framework, the EMA has prepared an health threat plan. Here you have the link to it, which is an internal guidance document describing how the agency operates during an emergency. And within this health threat plan, a key role is actually given to the EMA Pandemic Task Force, which is the ETF, old ETF, so to speak, a group of experts which is leading crisis-related regulatory activities, including interactions with manufacturers and evaluation of data, and it's in operation since the influenza H1N1 pandemic in 2009. And in the years after that, it will also was also convened for the Ebola and Zika outbreaks in the years between 2014, 2016, and 2018, 2019. So the mandate of the old ETF EMA Pandemic Task Force has been expanded in 2020, and here you have the link to its to the EMA web portal to cope with the COVID-19 specificities. So what is changing with the new regulation is that now the ETF is set in the legislation, and its role has been strengthened, building on this decade-long experience, and especially based on COVID-19 experience. Also, its name has changed a little bit. It's called Emergency Task Force. The acronym stays the same, but the mandate is clearly now for the ETF to operate upon declaration of a public health emergency by WHO, the Commission, but also during preparedness, during non-emergency periods. And if we move to the next slide, you can see more information about the new ETF. This group, which now, as said, has a formal legal mandate to operate, it's supposed to work as an advisory and support body to support the committees of the agency in terms of authorizing medicines for public health emergencies, monitoring for this medicine after authorization, and also, as I said, for preparedness. The regulation is also establishing objective and composition of this group, but allows ample flexibility, which is extremely important for a group that is tasked to operate in emergency situations. And also the membership of the group is based on expertise, also a very important point. Now here you see 3 squares, which are actually highlighting the key responsibilities of the ETF as established by the regulation. These are tasks that the ETF has undertaken even in the past, but has now been strengthened by the new regulation, as said, building on the successful experience during the past emergencies and especially during COVID-19. So I will tell you more in the following slides, but essentially the ETF will be responsible for providing scientific advices and support to clinical trials to developers. For example, it will be directly involved in assessing scientific advices application, and also it will be responsible to conduct scientific reviews, systematic assessment of emerging evidence on medicines targeting the emergency, and to provide recommendations to the committees of the agency on the use of medicines, for example, prior to authorization in case of an emergency situation, or to provide other recommendations to support to support member states and public health authorities in terms of scientific or public health matters of key relevance. And moving to the next slide, I will give you a little bit of the timelines of the activities which have been undertaken so far by the agency to support the initiation of the new ETF. Here you see the main date, which is the 1st of March, since when we started official activities, which is the date of implementation of the regulation. The ETF composition has been prepared in advance of this date, building on the experience, building on the existing composition of the existing ETF to ensure continuity of expertise in dealing with the same ongoing pandemic. The nominations have been then proposed by the various entities which are represented in the group, and I will tell you more about this in the next slide. And the composition so defined has been scrutinized and adopted by the management board on the 16th of March. The newly established ETF has then adopted its rules of procedure. This just happened yesterday, and now the rules of procedures are under consultation by the management board and the Commission, the European Commission. We foresee a positive opinion by around mid-April, and following this adoption, everything going well, it is foreseen that the ETF will then become fully operational around approximately the second half of April. We have therefore, as you can see, a transitional phase, and before the new ETF will become operational, under which the existing COVID ETF is continuing its daily activities under the current practice, the current mandate in support of the regulatory role of the agency during the COVID-19 pandemic. If we go to the next slide, you can see here what is the composition of the ETF, and this composition is specific for COVID. This is as adopted by the management board. There are 2 co-chairs, an EMA representative and the CHMP vice chair, which are actually chairing these session, and we have then a number of representatives from various groups, which you see here represented in these squares. The individuals have been chosen based on their personal expertise. So we have 14 members coming from the scientific committees of the agency, the CHMP, the PRAC, the PDCO, and the coordination group for mutual recognition and decentralized procedure, and EMA representatives. We have 19 representatives from the various working parties of the agency, which have an expertise on vaccinology, quality of biological medicines, infectious diseases, biostatistics, inspection, clinical trials, and others. We have 4 representatives from the patients and consumer working party and the healthcare professional working party, which have greatly contributed to the activities of the ETF even before, during the past 2 years. And finally, a new addition, we will have 4 clinical trial experts from various EU member states, and these experts have been nominated as representative of the CTAG and the CTCG, the Clinical Trial Advisory Group and the Clinical Trial Coordination Group. Finally, in addition to these members, we will also have additional experts and observers. They have a different role versus the members. They will contribute nonetheless to the activities of the group, and they will be coming from academia, national regulators in the EU, international regulators, and other agencies and bodies of the European Union. And if we move to the next slide, it's important to note that the composition that you have just seen, it doesn't remain set on stone, but it will change based on the needs. It is possible to change the composition during an emergency if there is the need, and to adapt it to a future emergency upon a declaration of a new emergency. So this is to focus the expertise, the activities of the group on the specific emergency. At the end of the crisis, for example, at the end of COVID-19, when the emergency will be declared over, the composition will be revised to then focus the group on preparatory measures. And finally, we have also foreseen possibly, we hope, an unlikely scenario where two emergencies are happening at the same time. In this case, for example, if we have now COVID-19 ongoing, potentially we could have a nuclear incident or a chemical incident, and in this case, the co-chairs of the ETF will consider whether new or ad hoc members may need to be nominated in addition to further support the activities of the group with specific expertise depending on the nature of the new threat. And if we go to the next slide, we are moving now to the third part of the talk, which is an overview of the tasks and responsibilities of the ETF. And I will go through these main three pillars, which you see here, and I have already introduced them to you: the scientific advice, support to clinical trials, scientific reviews, and scientific recommendation, which are the three main tasks of the ETF. So if we go to the scientific advice, the next slide, this slide is showing you a very high-level process for the scientific advice submission. If we start from the left-hand side of the slide in white with dotted line, you see the fate of an advice submission within the agency, the application for a scientific advice, for a standard advice, but is also what is currently done for COVID-19, will go to the scientific advice working party, and then upon finalization by this group, will go to the CHMP for adoption before being sent to the applicant. For a COVID-19 medicine, what is happening right now is that an advice, after being discussed and agreed by the scientific advice working party, will be discussed by the emergency task force, and will go back then to the SAWP and then to the CHMP for adoption. This process has been accelerated during COVID-19 to up to 20 days and has been also given free of charge based on ad hoc decisions by the executive director of the agency. Now, what happens with the new regulation, if you focus your attention on the right-hand side of the slide in blue, you see that the scientific advice for a medicine that is targeting an emergency or a potential public health emergency will be handled directly by the emergency task force without going to the scientific advice working party. So it's streamlined to go from the ETF directly to the CHMP for adoption when ready, and then to the applicant. It is also, well, now the acceleration to 20 days and the waiver of the fee is actually embedded in the legislation. So this is set by default if the advice includes clinical trial or question on the protocol, but leaves ample room for the agency to extend incentives and acceleration to other aspects of the advice. And importantly, the ETF will have to involve clinical trial experts belonging to national competent authorities, especially coming from the member states where the clinical trial is intended to be submitted for authorization, or already submitted for authorization by the developer. And this will certainly provide an added benefit in terms of harmonization of advices across EU authorities to facilitate trials authorization and ultimately improve access to medicine in the European Union. If we go to the next slide, here you see the other task that is under the responsibility of the ETF. The group is responsible for conducting scientific reviews and then subsequent recommendation based on emerging evidence, available evidence on medicines which are targeting the emergency. Such review and recommendation are then intended to be published on the EMA web portal, with the benefit that we have already seen during COVID-19, for example, reducing the use of medicines with insufficient evidence. That was the case, for example, for hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, among others, or also increase a safe and harmonized use across Europe ahead of a formal authorization. For example, the case of the ETF recommendation that was jointly with the CDC on mix and match COVID-19 vaccination or safety of vaccination during pregnancy. Another review of the ETF is to consider the emerging evidence for medicines which are in the pipeline and for getting ready for an approval by the CHMP. And this activity of the ETF will basically support the CHMP to decide when is the best time to start the rolling review based on the amount of evidence that has been accumulated. And ultimately, this will allow the committees to streamline the process, the rolling review, the authorization, and finally improve access to medicines in the European Union. If we go to the next slide, the final main task under the ETF responsibility is to support the committees with other kinds of scientific recommendations, both in a pre-authorization or post-authorization phase. For example, pre-authorization supporting the role of the PDCO in deciding on pediatric investigational plan, supporting the CHMP in assessing rolling reviews and conditional marketing authorization, and supporting the PRAC in the assessment of the risk management plan. Post-authorization, the ETF is a forum for discussion for major variations, for example, vaccine booster, and also for critical pharmacovigilance issues which are identified by the CHMP, by the PRAC chairs and vice chair. An important role of the ETF is also to support the CHMP in finalizing opinions on the use of investigational products or compassionate use programs. So this is the provision established in Article 18.3 of the regulation. The ETF can prepare a recommendation for the CHMP, and the CHMP will take it into account when making a decision on following a request from member states or the Commission on the use of unauthorized medicines. And also the ETF can prepare recommendations or position statement on scientific or public health matters related to the emergency, including, importantly, joint recommendation with, especially with the ECDC. Now, if we go to the next slide, this slide will give you an overview of other tasks of the ETF. They do not represent procedures per se, but they are nonetheless very important. And starting from the top, the ETF will have to liaise with clinical trial sponsors which are involved in conducting or planning similar or linked clinical trials to discuss potential joint trials and establishing agreement between sponsor and co-sponsors. And in doing so, the ETF will have to involve competent authorities for trial authorization. This will have the benefit to facilitate large multinational clinical trials in the EU and beyond. The ETF will also have to liaise with the MSSG and the expert panels on medical devices. You have heard about this earlier today on matters, specific matters related, for example, to reviewing the list of critical medicines in the case of the MSSG, or specific support to the expert panel on certain diagnostics, for example, concerning the expert panels on medical devices. Now, this is to ensure that within the agency there are robust cross-links that can support the role of the EMA during an emergency. And last but not least, the ETF will support the agency role in coordinating and interacting with EU bodies such as the ECDC, first of all, but also the agency activities under the umbrella of the International Coalition of Medicine Regulatory Authorities, the ICMRA Hub for International Regulatory Cooperation worldwide, collaboration with WHO and with other international regulators, among which you see listed here FDA, MHRA, and others. These activities will improve preparedness, will improve global harmonization and of regulatory decision, and ultimately will improve support to developers. Finally, but not least important, the ETF will have to collaborate to support the agency role in coordinating independent monitoring studies on the use, safety, and effectiveness of medicines post-authorization, always targeting an emergency, and specifically for vaccine will concern the creation of a monitoring platform, but I will tell you more about this in the next slide. And the scope of this will have to coordinate the generation of improved, better quality real-world evidence, and also the possibility to further support public health authorities with the publication of your recommendation. And if we go to the next slide, this is very important. It's the role of ETF in preparedness, which is also established in the regulation. The ETF will monitor outbreaks and epidemics that could become serious threats, especially focusing on developing the countermeasures, continue to provide scientific advices also for medicines which are targeting potential public health emergency. And in doing so, the ETF will consider strategy, developing requirements, drafting scientific guidance for developers on this medicine to prepare for future emergency. We'll have to maintain also an overview of the medicine in the pipeline for future emergency and maintain up-to-date information on potential agents which could be used, for example, for bioterrorism or radiological or chemical agents also deliberately released. And an important part will be to continue to coordinate activities with EU bodies, including HERA, ECDC, but also WHO and other regulators, which will remain important also to improve preparedness. And if we go to the next slide, I would just have a few, this is for the summary of the next step of the ETF. Just, here you have a summary of all the dates I already mentioned. And just to tell you that in the second half of April, the ETF is expected to become fully operational following the adoption of the rules of procedure by the Commission and the Management Board. So we expect that the first operational meeting of the ETF will occur toward the end of April, and until then, the existing COVID-19 ETF will continue to address the pandemic. Now, in the next slide, I just have a few more for you to show you some tasks which are also emerging from the new regulation for the agency to support the work of the ETF. This you already heard of from EMA and others. It's the creation of an IT platform for real-world evidence, DARWIN EU, which means Data Analysis and Real-World Interrogation Network. It's basically a platform to provide high-quality, validated real-world data on the use, safety, and effectiveness of medicines, which can be used by the ETF and other entities in the agency to address specific questions by conducting non-interventional studies or interrogating data sources. Will provide further support for solid and robust regulatory decisions. The establishment of DARWIN started already last year. It's been officially established in February 22 with the appointment of a provider, and the first studies are expected to be performed later this year as the pilot phase, for then becoming fully operational in the next coming years. And if we go to the next slide, another important task for EMA is to coordinate independent monitoring studies on use, effectiveness, and safety of medicines jointly with the ECDC, and especially for vaccines targeting an emergency. This implies the creation of a new vaccine monitoring platform, again, jointly with the ECDC. This is not an IT platform, it's actually a network of study providers building on learnings from COVID-19 study with the idea to then expand possibly to other vaccines. It includes the creation of a joint advisory board, including both representatives from national competent authorities and the NITAGs, the national expert groups for vaccination recommendation. It's already been established. This board met already twice last year to discuss protocols and results on safety and effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines. And the next step will be to create a blueprint for the vaccine monitoring platform, which is currently under preparation with the ECDC. And if we go to the next slide, just the last one is for the EMA to improve transparency. These are also provisions which are set in the regulation. Some of them are new on the left-hand side of the slide, which relate to the new ETF. The agency will have to publish information on the work of the ETF, will have to counteract this information targeting the ETF. The list of ETF members is already published after the 16th of March. The rules of procedure will be soon published following adoption, as said. And also the ETF will have to continue to keep updated the list of medicines which are currently under review by the committee for the emergency, in this case COVID, but also to create a list of medicines which in the view of the ETF has the potential to address the ongoing emergency. And then the agency will have other transparency requirements to comply with related to committee's decisions. For example, publishing an EPAR within 7 days from authorization, or the entire risk management plan or clinical data submitted to the EMA in support of this application within 2 months from authorization. And all of this is related to medicine targeting an emergency during a public health emergency. And this concludes my talk. So if I go to the next slide, I will just leave you with a few take-home messages. So what I told you today is that the emergency task force is now a legally established expert group which has been given by the regulation new tools to facilitate and accelerate approval of medicines during public health emergency, building especially on the COVID-19 experience. The regulation is also reiterating the importance of preparedness, with the ETF having a key role in leading and coordinating activities in preparedness for future emergency. The ETF has an important role to facilitate large multinational studies during a public health emergency, but especially in preparation for it, by supporting clinical trial sponsors. And this is a task that is embedded in a wider scope as established by the clinical trial regulation. There is room for improved collaboration and coordination across the various stakeholders, especially EU agencies like DG ERA and other groups, ECDC, and clinical trial groups, especially CTC, GNC, TAG, and national competent authorities. This is an important part. Now, all these aspects will lead to a better preparedness, and a better preparedness will translate into an improved response to emergency when this will be declared, and this will mean a guarantee for protection of public health in the EU and globally. And with this, Marco and Bruno, I give the floor back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuela, for a very clear presentation of what we can expect and hope for the new ETF. In addition to Manuela and what was just presented, we have today with us a rich alignment of panelists to support this discussion and to answer a few questions and participate actively in this discussion. I will now invite them to present themselves briefly and share a few words. And without further ado, we can start with Florian Schmidt. Florian, welcome.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and welcome from Brussels. We had actually snow today, so it is, yeah, but you are not interested in the weather forecast from Brussels, but in a few words from the Commission side. I'm here from DG Sante, Deputy Head of Unit in one of the pharmaceutical units, and obviously excited to see the ETF now taking the final route to being established under the new mandate. Is it the new kid on the block? Probably not. It is just a codified, if I use the lawyer speech, kid on the block, but good to see it fully recognized, and happy to participate in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. It's a growing kid on the block. Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Lucia Pastoric-Celentano. Thank you for joining us, Lucia.
Thanks, Bruno, and good afternoon, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Lucia Pastore-Celentano. I'm the head of the Vaccine Preventable Disease section at ECDC, and I've been working many years at ECDC as a medical epidemiologist, leading before the surveillance parts, and then the entire program of VPI. Bruno, would you allow me now a few reflections on the role of ETF and our contribution? Okay, many thanks. Because I would like to share with you some notes very briefly. And after the 2 years of pandemic, I think this experience has clearly shown us that we need a flexible, adapted, and rapid system that is tailored to emergency situations and when it comes to informing vaccination strategies. In the case of new vaccines, as for COVID-19 vaccinations on the market under conditional authorizations, we need to deploy at a large scale in the population vaccines very rapidly. And then we have many knowledge gaps as regard the best and most suited vaccination strategies and as well as the objectives of the vaccination programs. We have seen that we had to rethink in several steps what was the best strategies also according to the new variants that were emerging. And as scientific evidence emerged, in fact, our experience is that there was a need to adapt approaches or implement changes in the way even a specific product is used. And this has important implications and challenges for the practical implementation of programs, and as well as the communication to the public. That is a very important aspect. And we believe that doing this work efficiently requires rapid exchange, regular dialogue, and hand-in-hand work between regulators, NITACs, public health authorities, and program implementers, including vaccinators. And with the new ECDC and EMA mandate, we think that this can address the gaps, can address more efficiently in a more structured way. The agency can establish, learning from the way we worked jointly in the practice during the last month, ways of working that can efficiently shift from regular work in peacetime to an emergency phase. And in this context, the ETF, as Manuela has shown, it's a very important forum where ECDC is regularly invited to attend and contribute, and where this junction between regulatory and public health aspects on vaccine-related decisions or recommendations can be discussed. Likewise, the collaboration between our network of NITAGs and EMA regulatory experts is critical. I would like to really thank EMA because the colleagues Marco, Manuela have been instrumental in our exchange with the NITAGs in providing and discussing critical evidence on COVID-19 vaccines in the context of a rapidly evolving situation. And more of this is to come, particularly with the newer COVID-19 vaccines currently undergoing clinical trials. So we look forward to continuing working with you and to build a bridge of this gap between regulatory and public health bodies. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Already several aspects that will probably raise some comments in the discussion, but very positive feedback that we sincerely thank. Continuing the introductions, I will give the floor now to my colleague, Martin Huber, Vice Chair of the PRAC. Martin, welcome.
Thanks very much, Bruno. Dear colleagues, I'm more than happy to be here today. Yes, my name is Martin Huber. I work for the BfArM, one of the German medicines agencies, and I'm also the German PRAC member. I have actually been following the activities of the current COVID-19 ETF very much, of course, from a pharmacovigilance perspective. And I think we all know that there were a couple of issues that required thorough discussion. I am also honored to be part of the future ETF in my role as PRAC Vice Chair. And looking back a little bit based on the experience so far, I have learned that ETF is really a forum for very rigorous scientific discussions on any emerging issues in relation to the pandemic on a European level. And based on this experience, I'm also very optimistic that the new ETF will continue to be this forum, which is really essential and very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. It is also my pleasure to introduce another colleague, Dr. Powell, Mayor Powell. Welcome.
Thank you, Bruno. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm Myra Powell. I'm employed by the Irish Medicines Agency, the HPRA. I'm currently chair of the Vaccine Working Party of the EMA, and I also sit and I'm a past chair of the Infectious Disease Working Party. I was also part of the task force that dealt with the 2009 influenza pandemic. And I think that was really rather straightforward compared to what we've just been through and are still going through. And perhaps that is one of the main reasons why I also support and can see the great value of moving towards having a more formal and permanent ETF in place. I'll just take you back quickly 2 years ago now, just to illustrate what we've been through. I mean, 2 years ago, when the ETF started to convene regularly, we had no vaccines and we had no known treatments of any benefit or other preventive modalities other than restricting physical contact. And so the sort of advice we were giving to companies at that time about how to develop their products, and we were really in at the ground floor, as well as obviously discussing with other major health agencies and the WHO at regular intervals, the sort of advice that we were giving has had to be highly adapted as we've moved over the last 2 years. You know, we've gone from placebo-controlled vaccine efficacy studies to considering approvals based on comparable immunogenicity, for example. We've gone from treatments that now have to be given in addition to what is standard of care not being without any benefit at all. And we've had to rethink several other issues. For example, 1 year ago, we wrote a document that outlined what we might expect from variant vaccines. And although there's nothing wrong with that document, we've had to rethink since then several times what is actually now practical, feasible, and has it slightly changed what it is we absolutely need for regulatory approval. So I think we've come an awfully long way in 2 years. We have shown that we are a very adaptive group of people. And I think we also fully recognize that we will need to continue to be very adaptable, not just during this pandemic, but in the case of the next health emergency that will come to a head in Europe. And of course, we all know there's going to be one, but none of us can predict when it's going to be. So it's been a very exciting and I think fruitful time. The regulators have learned a great deal and we're still learning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I will give the floor now to Anne-Marie Jansen-Lang, who's also been with us at current ETF.
Thanks a lot, Bruno. So we have snow here in Stockholm also in the northern corner of EU, EEA. My name is Anne-Marie Jansen-Lang, and I'm from the Swedish Medical Products Agency. So I'm the former co-chair of the Clinical Trials Facilitation and Coordination Group. This is now abbreviated as CTCG in a new structure. I'm also the Swedish member of the Clinical Trials Coordination and Advisory Group. So that's the Clinical Trial Regulation Group. My background is physician by training with a clinical and research background as associate professor in neuroscience. And I have represented the clinical trials perspective in ETF since 2 years back. And I'm honored to continue to coordinate CTCG and CTAG on ETF members. So looking back a bit, what is it that we have done? One thing we have understood is that we have, as assessors of clinical trial applications, to work faster and to work in a very coordinated way, both the competent authorities and the ethics committees. And I'm proud to announce that we, the member states, have launched a multinational initiative to expedite clinical trial application assessment when it comes to COVID-19 therapeutics. So we think that expediting assessment without having any effect on quality of the assessment, of course, is a very important step, and this is one of our major challenges. We have also cooperated with the Commission and EMA working groups on guidance documents, for example, how to manage clinical trials during the pandemic. So here we need to be agile and flexible, and we have done as much as we can. You can always do more, and we have not finished, but I think it's important really to have this agility, not only on when it comes on application assessment timelines, but also when it comes to looking into the problem in new ways. And let me just finish by expressing what is perhaps clear to everyone, that clinical trials, they have the purpose, of course, to generate robust and reliable data. Later, you can use it as improved treatment strategies in the clinic, or you can apply for marketing authorization. But the prevailing interest from the clinical trial perspective is always the safety, well-being, and of course also rights and the even dignity of the trial subjects, and that's especially important when trial participants also are vulnerable subjects like children, pregnant women, and so on. So just to explain to you that as regulators by the clinical trial regulation, we have the role to say no to clinical trial applications if the participants receive inferior treatment compared to normal clinical practice. So I'm just giving you this background so that it's clear for everyone that we come together, we have ambitions, but we also have different roles, and the clinical trial perspective is first of all really to safeguard the subjects, the participants. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, it's time for me to give the floor to Alexandra Dasic-Pilcevic from the EMA.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Alexandra Dacic, and I'm head of department in EMA, Information Management Division, that collaborates with internal and external stakeholders on delivery of technology portfolio, extensive one that we are doing here in EMA. You're all aware of a big recent go live of a clinical trial information system that we did together with the member states and the Commission, and now we need to evolve more on that to make sure that system is continuing and evolving. But then with an effect of extended mandate, it's really also about providing the right tools so that we can facilitate in a better way this enhanced ETF process, and also to ensure that all relevant data is available in order to make the right decision making and opinion. I'm here today to provide an update and support the panelists on any related question to technology involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alexandra. And this concludes our very brief tour de table, and the dynamic nature of ETF became very clear for many of the interventions, and we certainly will have the chance to further discuss this. Before opening the floor to the various stakeholders, representatives who have been invited to join us here in the virtual WebEx room, I would like to invite all of you following the meeting to use this session to share your views on what should be the priorities for implementation and how stakeholders should be involved. You can use Slido code, hashtag EMA extended mandate. It's on your screen, and you have the QR code to give you faster access to that. In the virtual room, we have representatives from patients, consumers, healthcare professionals, pharmaceutical industry, academics, national and international competent authorities. So please raise your hand whenever you wish to take the floor, to open your microphone and speak. When speaking, we encourage you to turn on the camera and to make it more interactive, independently of the weather forecast on your region. And along with these oral interventions, of course, you can still use the chat. I have seen Francois and others have already started to use the WebEx chat room to introduce some questions that we'll try to address. And with this, Marco, I think we can open the floor for questions.
Indeed. So please raise your hand, as Bruno said, and I see already some question coming into the chat. So I would ask all of you, Francois, Michel, Dominique, maybe to raise your hand and to raise your question. I don't know who wants to start first. I see some of the questions were related to stockpiling, which indeed is not the primary scope of the ETF to start with, but I don't know, Francois, would you like to?
Thank you, Marco.
Please.
Yeah, it's more for a clarification, and you just replied that it's not the scope of the ETF, but to prepare for future emergencies, and even if we don't know which products from the critical medicine list will be flagged for this exercise, but will the reflection, the recommendation of the task force will go as far as recommending which products should be stocked at national or EU level due to the complexity of increasing the manufacturing capacity immediately, or any other factor which would drive the decision to maybe have some larger supply available at all times for these products, or not?
Yeah, indeed. I don't know from the panel who wants to try to answer. I don't know, Manuela, maybe to start with.
I agree with you, Marco. I think a recommendation of the ETF to the extent of what can be stocked at national level is beyond the scope of the group. The ETF will collaborate with the MSSG to define a list of critical medicine for the purpose of a specific emergency. So that will be then the role of the group in that context. And whilst there could be discussion in terms of stockpiling, and the support of the ETF and the committees will be in terms of authorizing medicine, in terms of preparedness, even before a future emergency, so that these medicines are available for stockpiling, such as the case for Invanex, for example, or a pandemic preparedness vaccine for future influenza pandemic, which can be then very fast modified, via type 2 variation with a minimum required set of data, and those are available for stockpiling also through initiatives by the European Commission. So this is as far, in my view, as far as the ETF can go within its mandate.
I think, Marco, if I may, this is Fergus here. Probably there's a role for the MSSG in terms of monitoring shortages and making recommendations, and some of those may be triggered or linked to the balances of stock, and then with here also on the member states themselves in how that's all managed. So the ETF is more on the scientific evaluation of the different medicines coming through the system, and the management of stocks is at the member state level, and then cooperating through HERA and the MSSG.
Yeah, no, thanks to both of you. I think it's important to clarify this aspect. I don't know if other panelists want to add anything on this. Okay, so I don't know, in case not, Bruno, I saw this comment in the chat from Michel Stoffer from Vaccine Europe, which I think it's an important one around the role on preparedness, which indeed is something that we will have to build on. So I don't know, Michel, do you want to say a few words and to expand a little bit on your statement in the chat, and maybe we take this as a topic for further discussion?
Perfect, thank you. So Marco and panelists, yes, first, it's a general comment. As Vaccines Europe, we conducted a quite in-depth exercise regarding the learnings from COVID-19 vaccines. And I think there was a general agreement from all companies who have developed COVID-19 vaccines that ETF has a very, very important role to play. And we are very happy with what I called the codification of ETF. If we looked at the learnings, basically what we believe is that preparedness is certainly critical. And basically, as priority, probably I would say the first thing is to look at the learnings from COVID-19 and see how we could improve the system, knowing that a future crisis might even be more severe than what we have seen with COVID. And basically, time is really essential. And just as an example, what we have heard from all companies is that labeling packaging requirements are certainly a major hurdle if we want to produce very fast vaccines and to cover a very large population. So there are certainly improvements on those aspects. And I think it would be good, as I was saying, to look at what we have learned from COVID and reflect how the situation could be even further improved for the future. The other aspect maybe, which is also something to be taken into account, is the early activation of the ETF. I mean, we have seen with H1N1 and with COVID, basically, that some activities, some interactions with authorities, for instance, were taking place before the official declaration of the pandemic. And so it's certainly very critical, again, to move very fast and basically that ETF as a kind of pre-activation form few months maybe before the official declaration of the pandemic, if we want to save time. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michel. I don't know if there are any additional reaction here, Manuela.
Yes, Marco, thank you. No, these are very important points made by Michel on labeling and packaging requirements. We have already indeed tried to ensure some flexibilities during COVID in discussion with the member states, which are also responsible for example, waiving specific requirements for labeling. But definitely this is an area that would benefit from further discussion in terms of lesson learned from this pandemic and preparation for the future pandemic. So that's an important point, you know, in view of future digitalization of labeling, etc. But you also made another important point, Michel, which is the early activation of the group. Now, I want to clarify. I think it's important to understand that the ETF is now established as a group of experts within the agency. So it will not disappear at the end of COVID, for example, to appear when an emergency will be then declared. So it will continue to remain active in time. The activities, the frequency of the activity, the frequency of the meeting of the group may be adjusted to the level of the activities required, but essentially the group will remain active. And this is, we believe this is critical, so that an interaction with the developer, with the stakeholder can continue during preparedness outside of any emergency context, so that pathway and routes for authorization of medicines are defined and discussed with the stakeholders as applicable. So this is I think is a very important point, which also links me to another point, which is the health threat plan of the agency, which is what I mentioned, will define what the agency will do in preparation during an emergency. And this is a document that we will have to update and revise to incorporate the new regulation and also the learning from COVID-19. So we will make sure that the agency has steps foreseen to react very rapidly together with the ATF and to better support the work of the ATF in preparation and during upon declaration of a public health emergency, which includes that period when we have an outbreak starting and the activities are going up before we have a formal declaration of an emergency, as you said. Thank you, Marco. Back to you.
Thank you, Manuela. And I guess maybe it's good also to say with respect to the scientific advice that this will happen also for products that will be developed in the preparedness phase, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed, that's correct. And this may happen also during COVID. So during COVID, the ETF may also support the CHMP in finalizing scientific advice on products which are targeting potential emergency for the future. So this will ensure that there is a consistency of approach for also for future emergency and a definition of strategies and requirements going forward, especially where vaccines are concerned.
Yeah, that is an important point. I guess it would be good maybe to hear from other panelists and
we have Florian. Florian raises his hand.
Florian.
Yeah, thank you. No, I just want to say, I mean, what is also an important message from the EMA mandate legal proposal is to clearly separate the tasks of the different groups. And therefore, because as we all know, in a crisis situation, if several groups deal with the same issues, then it will get complex. And therefore, it was good to make this comment of the role of the shortages management group compared to the ETF, and you mentioned the labeling and packaging requirements. The ETF, I mean, the primary responsibility of the ETF will be the scientific support during a crisis situation, while regulatory aspects will dealt with by other forces. So it is important to acknowledge the core task of the ETF, because in a way it will only function, or it has only functioned also greatly during the last 2 years, because it was clear they can focus on these aspects and then provide this important input to the other committees, exchange with the other stakeholders, and there we have seen the great value of the ETF on the aspect of the scientific matters, and that's also what the new ETF will do in the future. Just so to manage expectations, ETF is certainly not the doing everything. They will focus on the scientific aspects, building on the great expertise they have there. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. Important point. Anne-Marie?
Yeah, I think we can do much more in seeing that we can have expedited procedures. And I think we have shown that now with rapid scientific advices. I think we have to learn now what we learn in CTCure in the initiative on expedited assessment of COVID-19 therapeutics. I think it should also be clear for everyone that since the last January this year, we have a clinical trial regulation that gives a stage for much faster decisions than we have seen. So it's going to be a combined decision in each member state from ethics committees and competent authorities. And this is the system where we now see how much faster we can do the assessment when we do it together for multinational clinical trial applications. So I just would like to challenge a bit here to say that once we get more used to working in this EU portal, the clinical trial information system, and find ways how to work as smoothly as possible and not redundantly, then I think in the future, Europe will be one of the fastest regions for having authorization of clinical trial applications by large multinational clinical trial applications with ethics review, with competent authorities reviews. So this is where we are from the clinical trial perspective now, gathering information and planning for the future. So we did not have this clinical trial regulation until just recently, and we have just actually authorized the first trial within this clinical trial information system. But I think it's really important that we learn how to work fast, because in that way we can keep the clinical trials in Europe. And the lessons we have seen so far is that a lot of trials were mononational, just started in one country, and even more of them were done outside Europe.
No, thanks a lot, Anne-Marie. It would be fantastic to see this happening in the future. Indeed, during this pandemic, there have been quite a bit of hiccups around how fast was clinical research for trials that involve multiple countries. So it would be great to see all the efforts that you are taking in order to make this reality. And of course, here we are trying to go one further step, so to have a discussion within all the clinical trial authorities that are approving clinical trials in Europe and the EMA, because we all have understood that during a crisis such as a pandemic, things have to move fast. And the more we can converge on all the different level authorization for the products or authorization of the clinical trials, the faster it's going to be to move ahead with the protocols that are robust. So
yeah, and one aspect I think we have learned is that we have, as Bruno said in the beginning, different perspectives, and I think we have learned from each other. So from marketing authorization, from clinical trial application authorization, from PRAC, and from all the different committees, from inspectors and so on. I think that's one of the big gains here, that we are now exploring ways to work as one in the European Medicines Regulatory Network. And when we have explored this way, how to work more together with knowing more about each other, what are the different frameworks of each other, then I think we can be much better prepared for the future.
Yeah, that is really a strong and very good message. Thanks a lot, Marie, for that. So I don't know, but remaining on the preparedness, I don't know, Bruno, because this is an important aspect. I wanted to ask maybe Maya, as chair of the Vaccine Working Party, what is her perspective, indeed, as chair of this very important working party in the area of infectious diseases, with respect to what the ETL will be doing in the preparedness phase?
I guess that to some considerable extent, it's going to be based on horizon scanning. Marco, would you agree?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we can all work out principles in terms of what are the ways that we could react most quickly when we have to. But at the same time, it's going to come down to horizon scanning that is looking at the next most likely threat. I mean, to some extent, that's what we did in the early 2000s, and I've been a regulator long enough to remember this. But first of all, we started off with the idea that the world could be threatened by a deliberate release of smallpox. And a group that preceded the VWP was put together to look at how we could facilitate the rapid approval of additional smallpox vaccines. And then we had the H5N1 scare, which actually prompted the development of all the pre-pandemic guidelines, because before 2009 and H1N1 came along, it was our fear that the next influenza pandemic would be an avian reassortant strain, and the most likely candidate seemed to be H5, which was having very high mortality rates in some parts of the world. And that was actually what precipitated the development of all of the pre-pandemic guidelines, including the ability to produce a core dossier and then to rapidly vary the strain content. So, you know, we've sort of done it before, and I would see that this will be a very important driving force into what we do in inter-pandemic, or let me perhaps use the word inter-threat periods of time. But yes, it has proven to be very important in the past that we did this, and I think that it is a critical thing that we will continue to do going forward. And in terms of the ETF taking the lead, but yes, I think it is also the clear intent of EMA that it will draw upon the expertise within its working parties as it needs to, which is indeed highly appropriate. And that way of interacting, working, is working now, and I think it will work well in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Myron, and really a couple of excellent examples of the type of products and pathogens for which probably the ETF will have to be working on. So, and indeed, as you said, essentially almost the entirety of the Vaccine Working Party was involved in the ETF, as it should be, as you said, and we will continue to have this strong connection with the key working parties of the agency. So, okay, I don't see other hands up. Bruno, I don't know if there are other points that we might want to raise.
Building on this that was just shared, and I think I like the concept of inter-emergencies time, which we actually called preparedness. I think ETF brings or showed that we can actually have different people from different committees or origins within the system sitting at the same table, and became the privilege for these kind of discussions. And I think, as Mayor said, that this is a major change, because it will allow us, instead of having scattered discussions or perhaps not so organized ways of preparation, now we are all sitting at the same table. So this is really good. We had, as Marco said, a tremendous amount of members from the vaccines working party. We could not have done that without them. But also, and I take the opportunity to reach out to Martin, because I'm here also from the side of CHMP, but Martin from the PRAC as vice chair. Martin, in terms of interactions with committees, and we have basically 14 members of this new ETF coming from committees. What's your perception on the way it has been working so far, and what you think will be this in the future, this connection with committees, and how have they worked from your perspective?
Thanks very much, Bruno. I think indeed a very valid question, and I very much like what Maya said here, but also what Anne-Marie said earlier. We all come from different areas. We have a different background, but we have now learned to work as one. And for me, the experience from the pandemic with all the challenges and also the negative aspects is that we really have learned to come together, to sit at the same table. And for me, the ETF was kind of a best case example how to collaborate and how to work together. And Bruno, I think you mentioned that we have different committees at the European level. They all have their roles and responsibilities and their area of expertise, but all these bodies and committees have members representing them in the ETF. And from my perspective, these discussions at ETF have very much improved the interaction, but also the collaboration between the committees. Everyone has a different aspect to contribute, a certain expertise that is helpful, but I think at the end the challenge is the same for all of us, and more importantly the objectives are also identical for all of us. And I am very optimistic based on the previous experience that we will continue to work together in this very collaborative way, and that is important to have this collaboration in a rather established forum. So I think the ETF or the permanent ETF is really a good way forward to further strengthen this collaboration, but also to show that we have learned to work together, and it's not so much about competition, but really to work together and to share the common objectives. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. And just to actually agree on that from the CHMP side, and I think it's ETF became a facilitator of dialogue on very difficult questions that we were faced with. And I think from the side of stakeholders and mainly those who apply for marketing authorization, without ETF during these 2 years would have been very difficult to navigate through the system. So it became an enhanced support or pathway to reach the committees who in the end will issue the marketing authorization and the final opinion, well, not the marketing authorization, but the opinion to the Commission. So definitely, I think we need to learn from that experience. And from the side of the committees, I really would like to pick up on your words on it's not a competition, we complete each other, and we try to sit together at the same table, and ETF became the place to do so. And we hope that in times of preparedness, Marco, we continue again, because it's a new way of work, and instead of waiting for the crisis to happen, we'll actually prepare in a very organized way and having everyone at the table with the dynamics that the new ETF allows for the chairs to actually adjust the composition based on the needs. So that's also something very good for ETF. And passing the ball again to you, Marco, about communication, I think there's also an important role. Well, you've been doing that and ETF has been doing that, but I think now it's further reinforced, right?
It is, in fact, it is heavily reinforced, and I think Manuela mentioned that. And you know, during a crisis like this, how much communication can become important, and that's why the ETF has been playing a bit the role of starting to come out with certain position that needed to be timely in order to have an impact on public health decision in Europe. So there will be a continuum here, and we will see also in the coming days, you know, there is continuous discussion on the best use of the vaccines that we have for COVID-19. So ETF will have still to play a role in try to be ahead of the curve and coming up very rapidly with maybe some limited emerging evidence with some criteria, recommendation, or position statements that could help member states in taking decision and in order to try to get a more harmonized views with respect to the use of vaccines and therapeutics during an emergency. So definitely this is something important. And I see Anne-Marie raise their hand.
Yes, one other aspect I think is that you can say we have two types of sponsors in trials in Europe. Briefly, we have the academic, non-commercial, and we have the commercial, the companies. I think we have had a lot of rapid advices when it comes to companies and their strategies, but I think we need to plan more for how really to involve the very competent academic networks we have. We know that some are financed through big funds from the European Commission, but I think here we might be even better in the future if we try to figure out some things where we can do better, because these academic results from trials done outside the marketing authorization holder are also very important when it comes to repurposing drug, when it comes to doing trials to get additional information about clinically relevant questions. So just to make a proposal on something I think we need to explore more in the future.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And just to say that during this pandemic, anyway, the ETF has had the opportunity to give some advices to these academic groups. And of course, they are not used to interact with regulators, but we have been able to reach out to them and to establish some connection that in certain cases has turned out being extremely helpful in designing the study in a way that could then lead to an approval of medicine. So indeed, as you rightly say, this is an important area, and we need to see how we can do better in the future, interacting more with the academics group, because there are important data also emerging beside what is done by manufacturers. And here maybe I take the opportunity to ask Lucia from the ECDCS, as she mentioned and Manuela mentioned as well, the fact that within the task of the ETF, there will be also this role in the establishment of this platform for conducting also post-approval studies that are so important, as we learned throughout this pandemic, both in terms of understanding the effectiveness of the vaccine as rapidly as possible, but also to try to understand what kind of safety signals really are important to be followed up and really requires to be monitored carefully and to get in a timely way data. So I don't know, Lucia, of course, this is a bit of a journey, but it's very important that we work together to establish this framework and this platform. And what would you see as the main challenges in establishing networks that could run observational studies like effectiveness studies for vaccine in a timely manner, as we've seen coming up, like, for example, like from Israel or from the United States, and whether we can do something similar in Europe in the future?
Thanks, Marco, for this question. I think that the new mandate offers a great opportunity, not only for ECDC and EMA, but also for, all the citizens, because this establishment of this joint platform means that together both agencies work to facilitate, not only to facilitate the exchange of information on effectiveness and safety studies in real time, but also to build a very strong network of experts that and also, let's say, study sites as hospitals or healthcare workers cohorts that can be easily mobilized in case of need in the post-marketing phase. And the pandemic is teaching us that the big challenge we are facing so far is that we had simultaneously to set up this infrastructure and at the same time try to obtain data in a real time. And this is the big challenge right now, because we should have set up this platform, we should have funds available for that much earlier in preparedness time. Now we are in the situation in which we have few months to generate the data, but we are still setting up, I don't know, SARI systems for monitoring vaccine effectiveness in hospitals, trying to mobilize and increase the collaboration with the hospitals to run vaccine effectiveness studies with the doctors and healthcare workers in general. And also we are trying to put together all the registries in countries that have electronic immunization registries. So the big challenge now is to maintain this system, improve, expand, and have the data. I think we will have the data of COVID quite soon, both on safety and effectiveness, with a bit of delay, but this will be very important to test the system and to improve the system together, and to use this system on a more permanent base also for other diseases and other vaccines. And with at ECDC, we have been doing this since 15 years on influenza, and then we have pneumococcal network, pertussis network, but I believe it's now time to integrate all these networks, to have the possibility to have a forum of experts and panel of experts to discuss the scientific questions, the priorities, and what are the knowledge gaps that we need to address in according to the disease and vaccine we have, from both regulatory point of view and public health of view. But it's a long journey. It will not happen in one day. And I think we have done in 2 years already a tremendous effort from both agencies, perhaps a bit invisible at the moment, but I'm confident that soon the data and that we have generated will become available to the community. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucia. That's really an important area, and is a challenging one, but definitely one that I'm sure we will do better, and there is a lot to build up here. So thanks a lot for all the efforts of the ECDC on this. I don't know, Bruno or Fergus, if there is anything else, including comments in the chat that we need to discuss here.
I haven't seen any further comments in the chat, but Fergus, you've been contributing on the other side.
Monitoring the chat, and then my colleagues will be bringing up the Slido in a minute. So perhaps a few things just to yourselves. Maybe Bruno, you might want to comment yourself. That it's been partly discussed, but there's a question about the overlap between ETF activities and the conditional marketing approval authorization at the level of the CHMP. I don't know if you want to say a couple of words about how the ETF supports that.
Very quickly, it won't change much from what we've been doing so far, and it's been working very well. The CHMP remains the guardian of that decision, and the advice comes and maintains from ETF. But again, as you could see, there's a very tight interaction, and we've seen that with the COVID product, between the committees, between the rapporteurs and the assessors involved. They are all invited to the ETF, they participate, committees are invited. So ETF becomes basically a pre-discussion forum, a facilitator of interactions with the sponsors and with the applicants. That makes the navigation through the decision phase, either conditional or full marketing authorization, much easier. So that's very rapidly, that's the experience we have. I don't think it will change. It will only improve, if anything.
No, I think that's a really good feature of the process, and indeed, the further adding of the clinical trial representation and strengthening that, and the advice on clinical trials just helps the results that finally come to the CHMP to be so much better. There's another question, and Mayor, you referred to this in part, is what plans are there possible medication against biological warfare effects? So we have, I don't know if Mare or Marco want to reply briefly on clearly there's a part of preparedness also with these what might be deliberately released pathogens.
I don't know, Maya, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, clearly this is now going to be an obvious and stated part of the ETF's mandate to look at these potential threats. But again, it's going to come down to perceptions in our changing world as to what the next threat might be. And the next threat, as I mentioned, might not be a pandemic. It might be, as Fergus has said, something quite different. But the ETF's remit now would cover all of these things and would also cover working with the relevant experts depending on what the perceived threat is going to be. So I think it's now going to be properly covered by the constitution of the new ETF. So that's really good, rather than what we've maybe had to do in the past, which is scrabble together a group of people as and when. So that I see as a very positive move. But again, it's going to come down to what we perceive in terms of horizon scanning as the next major issue, or at least is a reasonable expectation of what the next type of major issue might be, because we might end up drawing up broad guidelines that are not absolutely specific because we can't be specific. And again, we've done that sort of thing in the past. Over to you, Marco.
Yeah, no, completely agree. And I would just add by saying that indeed on the EMA webpage, we have already a list of biological or chemical threats. And this is coming because there is an article in the legislation that asks the EMA to keep a list updated with respect to countermeasures for specific biological or chemical threat. This was a list that was done many years ago. So what we will be doing is to constantly review that and update that as needed. But I guess that will remain the starting point for having a list of what might happen in the future, even if, you know, as Mar said, it's very difficult to predict what might be causing the next problem, but still we have to be vigilant and we have to at least monitor those pathogens or scenarios that are more likely to cause outbreaks, epidemics, or crises in the future. And that's what we will be looking into. And of course, more in the general sense, we are looking into a number of efforts that have been put up, like from the WHO, in defining list of pathogens that might be causing epidemics in the future and therefore requires to be followed up. So that probably will be the starting point. But with the ETF, we'll be discussing what could be a reasonable list to start with of threats that we have really to monitor carefully.
Okay, thanks very much, Marco. Now, there are a couple of other questions that I'll just try and address directly. One thing, just to apologize to those asking, there have been a number of questions on specific medicines, and it's not the form of this workshop to enter into discussion on particular individual medicines. But also a lot of questions about veterinary medicines and what's the scope of the ETF, what's the scope of the MSSG. So I think the easiest is if I refer to the regulation directly, because it's a small paragraph for those that want the reference. It's Article 5.3. And there, I'll just shorten it slightly in reading, but it says the MSSG may consult, and the ETF articles cross-refer here also with the CVMP, so the Committee for Veterinary Medicinal Products, in order to deal with public health emergencies or major events relating to zoonoses, so infectious agents arising from animals, or diseases that affect only animals and that have or may have a major impact on human health, or where the use of active substances for veterinary medicinal products may be useful in addressing the public health emergency. So it's always about human health, but there may be reasons to bring in our veterinary experts, either because of the nature of the disease or because of the active substances that are used in both animal and human species, so antibiotics, for instance. Another quick couple of questions. One about links between the EU clinical trial website and the FDA clinical trials website. So both the US clinicaltrial.gov and our EU clinical trial register are providers of data to the WHO International Clinical Trial Registry platform, and it's there where the different clinical trials from US, European, and indeed other registries are joined together. So you can see the links at that point. And I think finally a question on the links between ETF and ACT-EU. So ACT-EU is accelerating clinical trials in the EU. It's the joint initiative of the heads of medicines agencies, the European Commission and the European Medicines Agency, to really build up Europe's capacity and attractiveness as a location for clinical trials. And this obviously spreads far beyond the public health emergencies into oncology, cardiovascular, the whole range of clinical trials and medicines. But clearly there's a lot been said, and Anne-Marie expressed some of that very well. We've learned a lot during the pandemic as well about how we can be better at that, how we can support academia better, and the need to run larger and multinational clinical trials. So I think there'll be an interaction, particularly in the lessons learned at the policy level, but ACT-EU is more a policy body. But could I ask colleagues just to bring up the Slido and see if we've anything different there that we haven't addressed? But I think probably, okay, so again, we get the veterinary medicines question is there at the top, in fact, so good I answered that one. What does preparedness concretely mean? So I think the panel have discussed that well. Clearly there's a lot more to discuss there, and these are things that will evolve. People have used the term lessons learned. We will never stop learning lessons, and we should never stop learning. So preparedness is as both a reflection on what has happened, anticipating the future, but constantly learning and adapting. The stockpiling, as we've said, that's issues to do with shortages, stocks, etc., more in the realm of MSSG, HERA, and the member states. I think going down then, ACT-EU, we've addressed. Can we have a public introduction video? So I think my communication colleagues will listen to that, and certainly it's good to know these are useful. Another threat could be on connected devices to inject. Okay, well, I think this is really a device safety issue about the security, cybersecurity of devices. I think is I'm sure something that's looked at by device experts. And I think we've covered the rest there. So I'll hand back to Marco for a quick wrap up. All yours, Marco.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Fergus. Thanks a lot, Bruno, and to all the panelists and to all of you for your really good points and comments and questions. I think what might be, the key messages that I'm hearing from the discussion we just had now is that the ETF has been very successful in providing really rapid regulatory feedback to developers and enabling the agency to move, rapidly into decision making in the context of a very complex emergency such as this pandemic, but also importantly has found its place within the different committees of the EMA. So really being a group that serves as a key advisor to CHMP mainly, but also to PRAC, PDCO, and also giving rapid scientific advices to companies. And this has been the added value of the ETF as a whole. And also, as Anne-Marie mentioned, the important link to the clinical trial authorization, particularly when there are multi-countries clinical trials, because there is really a need of converging rapidly into what are the key aspects that needs to be addressed. So this is the first element. So the position of the ETF in the context of the different groups and the regulatory network in Europe. And then secondly, what I'm hearing loud and clear is the importance that the ETF maintains its activity also in the preparedness phase, because also, as Manuela said, there is not a good response without good preparedness. So it's very important that we think about maintaining ETF active and scanning the horizon, as Mar said, in order to see what will be emerging and having maybe a list of the pathogens and scenarios to be focusing on to start with. And then from there, we will start in giving scientific advice to developers and see what has to be done so that we are better prepared in the future. I don't know, Bruno, did I miss anything relevant?
Excellent as always, Marco. Full support.
Thank you, Bruno. Back to you, Fergus.
Okay, listen, thank you very much, Marco, Bruno, Manuela, and the whole panel and audience for really excellent presentation and discussion. So we'll take a 10-minute break now. We'll come back at 2:30 on the dot, and there we'll look at the expert panels on devices and in vitro diagnostics, and we'll have a chance to explore that part of the new mandate. So thanks again very much, everybody, but please stay connected, and we'll all rejoin at 2:30 in 10 minutes.